Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for coming along this evening. May I welcome you to the 4th annual Lord Patton Lecture on Social Renewal. My name is Mark Shucksmith and I'm the Director of Newcastle University's Institute for Social Renewal. I'll explain in a moment what social renewal is and introduce our speaker, but first I've a commercial break. I have to do a little bit of advertising for the next couple of events that we have. On Thursday, we've another public lecture here from Naomi Eisenstadt, who was the first director of Sure Start, and her talk is on Sure Start, Sure Stop, which will probably resonate with many of you. I'm sure that will be an excellent lecture as well. And then next week, on Thursday, a week from today, on the 15th, the Newcastle University Humanities Research Institute will hold its official launch with a debate on the challenge of change. The 4 panellists will be the historical novelist Philippa Gregory, who wrote The Other Boleyn Girl, the poet and broadcaster Lem Sissay, the Harvard historian David Armitage, and Emma Tucker, deputy editor of The Times. The debate is, as with all the Insight events, free and open to all at the usual time of 5:30, but will be not here, but across the road in the banqueting hall of the Newcastle Civic Centre. So if you plan to come along to that, just come along in the usual way, but remember that it's across the road in the Civic Centre, and we hope to see you there. So that's the commercial break. As I say, this is the 4th annual Lord Patton Lecture on Social Renewal, and maybe it would help to provide a bit of context if I just spend a moment explaining what we understand by social renewal. Newcastle University has set out its vision to be a world-class civic university. And that means not just being excellent, that's the world-class bit, in our research and in our teaching and learning, but taking our place in the wider world and putting our excellence to a purpose, helping to address the major societal challenges of our time through engaged research and engaged teaching and learning. So we try and ask not just what we're good at, but what we're good for. And to this end, the university has identified 3 societal challenges to be the focus of our efforts in this regard: ageing, sustainability, and social renewal. And there's an institute to try and help with taking each of those forward. Now, you may think I haven't made social renewal any clearer to you at all, so let me give you a definition. We define the challenge of social renewal as addressing the question, how can people, communities and societies thrive when faced with rapid transformational change? So how do we thrive in the face of rapid change? In Britain and elsewhere, the impact of globalization, technological change, demography, and the effects of capitalist economic growth are creating challenges of enormous magnitude to which there are no simple or obvious answers. Which brings me to Postcapitalism and tonight's lecture and our speaker tonight, Paul Mason. I'm really delighted to welcome Paul Mason here this evening. I'm a long-term fan. I've admired his work for several years now, whether in his reports and analyses on BBC Newsnight and then Channel 4 News, in his excellent documentaries, in his column in The Guardian, or in his tweets from the front line of the Scottish independence referendum or the Greek crisis. My friends in Scotland still maintain he was the only English journalist to understand what was going on in the independence referendum. And my friends in Greece are similarly impressed. You may also be surprised to learn that Paul's background was originally in music. He started off doing a music degree, and that he's a devotee of Northern Soul, which, like the Northern Powerhouse, perhaps hasn't quite reached the Northeast yet. So I won't anticipate what Paul's going to say in his lecture tonight, except to say that I found his book, Postcapitalism, a joy to read. I found it convincing in its analysis, impressive, really impressive in its scope and ambition, and highly intellectually stimulating. And you may have noticed there's a large pile of them outside on sale. I think it's especially useful when trying to think about change and social renewal. I hope you'll find his lecture tonight equally stimulating and inspiring. Thank you very much.
Right. I just need to I need to work out whether I can actually read my own writing off my own computer and at what distance I need to be away from it. Hello. Just before we start, put your hand up if you've just come to Newcastle University, including people who are in the other room. There's 100 people in the other room. Anybody just arrived? Not many, but good. Good. Okay. So most people know where Newcastle is. Okay, right. Well, Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for inviting me to this lecture, and thank you to Lord Patten for initiating the series. There can be no greater social renewal than the one I'm about to talk about, and Newcastle, one of the oldest industrial centres in the world, is a good place to be proposing it. Because you would only have to stop on any of the bridges across the Tyne and look down in either direction to understand that capitalism has a life cycle. It had a beginning. You look hard in the brick bits, Newcastle people, the brick bits. It had a middle, and it's quite possible that it's going to have an end. Travel to Durham, and you'll see what came before capitalism. A system based on landholding, military and religious obligation, very different to the industrial society of the last 200 years, but still capable of creating a massive piece of stone on a hillside, possibly bigger than any other piece of stone, for miles around. Travel to Wallsend and you'll see the remnants of the system that came before feudalism. That is, a system based on slavery and conquest we know as the Roman Empire, of which this river and the wall just north of it was the northernmost limit. In case people don't realise, that is for those of you who get your history from these sources, that is the source and model for the wall in Game of Thrones. And it was equally savage. So capitalism is just the latest in a series of complex systems human beings have used to organise society. Marx called them modes of production. Call them what you want. It's very obvious that history has moved in a succession of economic models. Logic tells us it's quite possible that capitalism will be replaced itself by something better, more dynamic. But that's a massive affront to neoliberal ideology. Neoliberalism didn't just tell us that the world is friction-free, the world is flat, the end of history. Neoliberalism didn't just put a gift shop in Guantanamo Bay where you could buy a t-shirt that says, "It don't get more better than this." It told us that that was the most perfect system and therefore unchangeable and final. That's the core of the economic ideology that runs the world. And of course, if you know about my work, and if you read the first chapter of my book, you will know that I think that is rubbish. But what I'm also about to say might dismay some of the people who built this city and this region's labour movement culture, who embedded socialism, communism, social democracy and syndicalism into the traditions of the Northeast. Because the route beyond capitalism I'm going to talk about is not the one they imagined. Not the one, if you go to Durham Miners Hall and see those amazing ranks, semicircular agora of the working class, each seat with a gold number on it. It is not the route that the men who built that imagined. I believe a new route beyond capitalism has opened up because information technology is different. Specifically, information technology has begun to do three things. It's corroding the price mechanism, it is loosening the relationship between wages and work, and it's corroding ownership, creating new collaborative networked forms of organisation in which things and the work to create those things can be provided sometimes for free. Information technology, in short, I argue, opens up a route to the abundance of some things, to a massive reduction in necessary work, and to a long transition where the capitalist sector of the economy will coexist and interact with a post-capitalist sector. You will have noticed by now that this is not one of those public lectures at university where I'm just going to give you kind of ABC type stuff, 101 type stuff. I'm giving you what I would give an academic audience because I think that inter alia, the university should be cascading the best of its knowledge out to the rest of society. So you're getting the not dumbed down version here. I hope you can. If I go too fast, I've already posted all these lecture notes on a website called Medium. You can just follow my Twitter handle and find it. Technology is creating a route out of capitalism, and I believe creating a new kind of human being, and new forms of organisation which constitute a new agent of change. And the change is going to be necessary because on the negative side, information is a technology that I believe has begun to suppress the most important thing about capitalism for its 250-year industrial history, and that is its ability to adapt. If you know about these debates already, you'll know that I'm not the first person to say neoliberalism is a zombie economic system. In fact, it's quite a common thing to hear once you get north of Watford on the train. Nor that peer-to-peer technology creates the possibility of a collaborative, non-market productive system. I will say, however, I'm the first person, I think, to show plausibly how the crisis and stagnation gripping the neoliberal present might be linked and might be a symptom of the post-capitalist future. And that's effectively what the book is about and what I'm going to try to substantiate in the rest of what I say. Right, first of all, what do I mean by capitalism? It's more than just an economic structure or a set of laws and institutions. By capitalism, I mean the whole system, social, economic, demographic, cultural, ideological, needed to make a developed society function through markets and private ownership. It's a complex system operating beyond the control of individuals, governments, and even economists. The system is adaptive. It morphs constantly and not just in small increments. At major turning points in the 250-year history of industrial capitalism, it has mutated in response to danger, creating patterns and structures barely recognizable even as capitalism to the generation that came before. Some of you, looking around this audience, have lived through one of those mutations. Some of you really old people might have lived through two. Really little people might have lived through two. Its most basic survival instinct is to drive technological change. And if we consider not just infotech, but food production, birth control, global health, the past 25 years have probably seen the greatest upsurge in human capability over the world around us ever. But the technologies we created, I will argue, are not compatible with the present form of capitalism, nor even they may be with capitalism at all. Marxists, including Marx, I will argue, consistently underestimated capitalism's adaptive nature. I've argued in the book that the serial disorientation of the left, Marxism and the wider left, after 1900 was partly due to this. Marxism operated with a good understanding of the basic contradictions, the dynamics of capitalism, but it regarded the adaptability as accidental or political or being the product of talented leaders rather than objective forces. And I will argue that the adaptability has been up to now is not a second order thing, it's a primary order thing about the system we're in. So here's the problem. Information technology might be eroding capitalism's ability to adapt. And if so, that's at a very bad moment because we're also facing two, what we call exogenous shocks or external shocks to capitalism, and that is climate change and demographic aging. The good news is the technology that's caused the problem, I believe, holds the solution, but only if we radically change the social arrangements on the planet to cope with a world where there is more free stuff, less work, less hierarchy, and where you can build machines that are free and last forever, and which may, in time, become intelligent. So, let me give you the kind of, this is the kind of, if this was a car manual, you know those old car manuals, used to get books, remember those? This would be the bit that where it's the engine. It's the real one where you don't want to be going there for too long without coming up for a pint or a breath of fresh air. I'm going to give you the nuts and bolts of the argument. It was the economist Paul Romer who in 1990 pointed out the essential fact that information goods are different. In his paper, Endogenous Technological Change, if you remember, that's the one that Ed Balls made the joke about. It was meant to be an in-joke at the Treasury. We don't sit around talking about endogenous technological change. Well, it's a really important paper and contains the following argument. Romer adopted a deliberately facile description of what information goods are. He argued they are, quote-unquote, instructions for mixing together raw materials, i.e. for making things. I like that description because it forces us to understand that the information in, say, an MP3 file that makes an iTunes track or Spotify track is just the instruction for making the speakers on my laptop vibrate and produce a physical analog sound. Information goods are different, says Romer, because with digital technology, the cost of reproducing them is zero. Instead of a vinyl press to produce a second and third and fourth and 50th copy of an LP, you just need two gestures. Command V, Command C, Command V. Copy, paste. Information goods, whatever it's cost to make the original, can be copied or shared infinitely, says Romer, because if one person is using it, another person can still use it. With physical goods, if I'm in the parking space, you can't be in the parking space. If I'm smoking the roll-up, you can have a bit of the roll-up, but it's not the same bit that I'll be smoking. You see, you get the point. Economists call this rivalry. Most physical goods are rivalrous because two people can't use them both at the same time. Likewise, non-rivalry is the word Romer uses to describe information goods. Information goods can be used by more persons at once without degrading them. There's another word for non-rivalry. It's a simpler one, shareable. They are shareable in a different way than most other goods. You can use a music track, an e-book, the digital mock-up that makes an Airbus A380, an entire personal data of an entire population on Earth without degrading it or preventing someone else using it. And in that sense, digital information is, by its nature, abundant. Of course, you can, and modern capitalism does, do something about this. You can create an artificial scarcity. You can put a code into the information on a DVD that prevents it being copied. You can protect it by law or patent. You can go around the car parks of everywhere on Earth arresting people who try to sell DVDs out of satchels. You can do all of that, but an artificially created scarcity is not really capitalism. Capitalism is about granular, self-replicating economic relationships, ultra-complex markets of the kind that quantitative analysts and maybe economists at this university will study, which satisfy demand by creating supply mediated through a very complex and ever-changing price system. That is a spontaneous thing. The founder of marginal utility theory, Leon Walras, the economist, the 19th century economist, wrote in 1874, "There are no products which can be multiplied without limit. All things which form part of social wealth exist only in limited quantities." That definition means, and it still applies, that economics actually only applies to scarce things. And the problem, of course, now is, Pache Walras, he's wrong. All things, there are no products that can be multiplied without limit. There are. All things that part of social wealth are scarce. No, they're not. Now, when I tour the country and indeed in future the world, talking about this thesis, which is not my thesis, it's a thesis I stand on the shoulders of a lot of other people to do this. I will insist on the importance of that. If that is true, then we're at a big turning point, because it means whatever the production cost of an information good, the reproduction cost should fall, given competition, to its production cost, zero. And this, what is called the zero marginal cost or zero price mechanism or vortex, is observable almost everywhere you see information goods. It's true, incidentally. Maybe there's a part of the room or the other room that is a kind of a Marxist economic theory kind of specialism. And it's true even if you use labour theory of value economics. It's true that if there's no labour going into the product, either via the copy-paste action or through the prior labour of what made it, if it is infinitely reproducible, then the labour value of the product is close to zero. In the same way as for mainstream economics, the cost of production is close to zero. So, you can argue about how to motivate the producer. How should we motivate Beyonce to release a surprise album straight to the internet with 3 extra tracks than anybody expected? That's an interesting question. But you cannot argue about what the spontaneous price of those MP3 tracks will be if they were not protected by intellectual property rights and indeed little widgets inside the software to stop them being copied. It would be zero. What the actual price is, of course, on iTunes is 99p. That 99p price, which applies to Beyonce's latest track, some pile of rubbish produced by a teenage garage band, and Beatles' Love Me Do, and indeed every track on iTunes, has nothing to do with supply, demand, or quality. It has to do with the fact that Apple has near dominance in the sphere of digital music. With information goods, prices can only be maintained then through patents, copyright, encryption, or monopoly. And these are, I will point out, overt social arrangements that have to be reimposed every day, and they are not self-creating spontaneous market relationships at all. Now, the reason why we know that things that have to be reimposed by law, by coercion, every day from the computer screen of an all-powerful person don't last is because we saw what happened in the Soviet Union. I would argue that, in other words, these monopolies that surround us are about as natural as Gosplan was. They are going to be about as long-lived as well. Because in the space of 25 years, corporate giants have, of course, created huge piles of hoarded information which, as the hippie thinker Stuart Brand once said, wants to be free, is in fact walled up in a garden around which there is guarded by information lawyers, patents, artificial technical bottlenecks, constant attempts to tie one technology to the use of another technology in order to prevent technologies being interoperable and free. That is the kind of world you live in as soon as you pick one of these up, or indeed the mobile phone in your pocket. And the result is monopoly on an unprecedented scale. There used to be a big four in most markets. Big four banks, big four accountancy firms, 3 or 4 overlapping engineering firms that make turbofans in the airline industry, 5 or 6 global car giants. In tech, there's only, in each vertical sector, a big one. Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon don't really compete with each other except at the margins. They compete with each other in overlapping parts of their business, but each one of them is dominant in a basic and core business. They dominate a specific space. Now, it is not Marxism, but basic market economics that suggests such monopolies cannot last. Nokia once had 40% of the global mobile phone market. I don't think it has that anymore. In 2011, when the riots took place, we were all worried about Blackberries. We're not worried about them anymore. That's what happens to monopolies in any system that doesn't have a completely hegemonized and state-controlled market. Of course, in a way, this is, in the shape of the United States, what the tech companies would like the United States economy to become. A service industry for their dominance, protected by absolute rights over intellectual property. If it was up to Hollywood, I don't know if there's any Hollywood people here, Hollywood actually has industries all over the world, and when you meet somebody who's involved in it, you don't want to talk to them about copyright. Because what they would like is for copyrights to be infinite. There's no decay, there's no Cliff Richard songs going out of copyright after 70 years in the mind of the Hollywood. That, to have and to have not should be the property of Universal Pictures until the world actually burns, and you must pay the same price for it forever. Even if you can pick up the DVD in a car boot sale. That's the way they think, is that. When I started writing the book, iTunes had a 95% market share in online music. Unleash market forces on iTunes. What happens? Well, it takes, somebody's worked this out, a signed band, a signed music artist, signed to a record label, 1,500 plays on iTunes to earn the minimum wage. On Spotify, which those of you who don't use it may not know, is a sharing service where you pay a fee per month and you get access to a lot of music, not individually paid for. The Spotify itself distributes the revenues. It takes you 1 million plays to earn the minimum wage if you're a signed band. Interestingly, it takes you a lot less than that if you're not part of a record label. If you go yourself to Spotify and sell the music direct to it. But either way, unleash competition, and what you get is the zero price effect on digital goods. Kenneth Arrow, the doyen of mainstream economics in the mid 20th century, once wrote that in a free market society with intellectual property, the outcome would be what Arrow called the systematic underutilization of information. If we're producing information to create IP out of it, then the aim is that not everybody in the world can access that information. If you happen to be an academic at Newcastle University and you have written a paper for an academic journal, you will know exactly what I mean. Because when I'm trying to research these books, one of the most frustrating things is to find a piece of knowledge you want and to discover that if you're not a member of one of these university systems, I'm afraid, even when I was visiting professor at Wolverhampton, for some reason their system didn't run to access to all academic journals. You're going to have to pay $100 just to look at the front page of the actual thing. So the systematic underutilization of information is a product of having a free market and an information economy, says Arrow. We're going to have to reverse the logic of that statement to produce the following proposal. That in a society where there is full use of information, you can't have a fully functioning market nor ownership system over information. And basically, that is what I'm arguing. That is the basic thesis of post-capitalism. But collapsing reproduction costs don't only apply to books and movies and music tracks. Once we define information properly, the dynamic begins to unfold over the physical world. Of course, the information debate is surrounded by elusive words like virtual or cognitive or immaterial. One of the founders of information science, Norbert Wiener, insisted in 1948 in his book Cybernetics, quotes, "Information is information, not matter or energy. No materialism that doesn't admit that can survive in the present day." I think that's wrong. I think there can't be information without representation. There's a big debate about this in the philosophy of information, which is itself a new genre in academia. But I am on the side that says information requires representation, and even the smallest unit of information, the byte, as in kilobyte, needs both matter and energy to be represented. Information, of course, has its own laws and dynamics, and they exist independent of the representation, but it is part of the physical world. A silicon chip's a machine with 1 billion switches. Broadband bandwidth, you may be using your computer on broadband, is copper wire with sophisticated machines at each end of it, called switches. Storage, that you store the information on, is a piece of magnetized metal. In fact, if you open up a little hard drive, to us oldie people, it looks reassuringly like a record player. A hard drive has a little disc with an arm spinning. Who knew? You know that? I mean, it's all physical. The point is, the effective price of these physical machines, processing power, bandwidth, and storage capacity, is falling exponentially by an order of magnitude every couple of years. And so, what it would cost to store something completely basic, like, say, the complete works of Shakespeare, is actually zero. It costs nothing, or close to nothing, in terms of mass, energy, and on your computer, price. So the close to zero effect is not just a function of information's replicability, it's a function of what the information revolution is doing to the hardware of information itself. And as a result, one of the disorientations in modern society is our inability to understand the economic value of information and to calibrate this great disappearing act that has taken place in our lifetimes from the mainframe, where you had to queue up. You remember that? Queue up to go on the mainframe. Right, they disappear. The server's there. Then the server goes to India. The call center, the IT department goes to the call center in India. The mouse disappears. The hard drive disappears. Things disappear off your desk. You're just left with a thing that processes information better than anything that you would have known 10 years or even 5 years before. We don't understand how to calibrate that disappearing act. The OECD, in its first major attempt to do so, concluded in 2013 that while the internet's impact on market transactions and value added has been far-reaching, its effect on non-market interactions is even more profound. So that's almost like saying there's a parallel universe. We can measure the economic action effect of information here in the economy, but we kind of know there's a parallel universe that we can't measure. And to me, that's not good enough. And in the book, I try and advance some ways to address that. And that it's unfortunate that we can't measure it, because in the great technological miracle, I believe, of the last 15 years has not been in the invention of new things, but with old things coming alive with a new layer of information. The art gallery, the airliner, firing up information back to base, people sitting in it, producing and consuming information. The atomic structure of the fan blade in the engine of the airliner is an information product. It cannot exist. It is not a product of metallurgy, as some of you might be metallurgists, of the old school where blades used to be made with a hammer in a forge on later cast. It is grown in a vacuum out of a single crystal, and its atomic structure could not have existed unless a computer pre-existed it. So we're in a world where reality is suddenly has this patina of information we don't know how to price. But we can observe the effect. We could just observe the effect that things are becoming cheaper and they take less labour to make. And if we unleashed that process, we could do something quite radical. We could reduce the amount of necessary labour on the planet to produce and reproduce what we need. In other words, we could promote both the information effect of abundance and the physical, as it were, reflection, the reflection on the physical world that information creates. We could promote abundance in both categories, and we could have a lot of things cheaper or free. That's essentially the bit. That's the engine bit of the Morris Minor manual. So if that's done your head in, the next few bits will hopefully be easier. So the next impact of information is on work. It's begun to de-link work time from wages. Our dads worked in sequential processes where time spent on the job was rewarded with wages. They clocked in, they clocked out, they needed managers, because if you made this bit of the car before you made that bit of the car, it's not going to stick together. Okay? Ditto the ship, ditto the blast furnace. There had to be a sequential process. As the 150-year process of mechanization took place, workers moved increasingly to the side of production, to the side of the machine. They didn't operate it, they minded it, they corrected it. By the early 60s, you had electrified production processes, hydraulic power, some basic logic systems replacing the brain of the worker, but there were no feedback sensors. The workers were the feedback sensors. That's why the electronics revolution of the 1960s onwards did not produce an information revolution until we could, as we are now, build equally capable sensors. So the Italian factory workers, interviewed by the New Left in the 60s, because of this, began to reject their dad's understanding of work. The generation that had overthrown Mussolini understood the factory as this noble utopia, the centre of the world. The workers of the 60s thought that, as they put it to sociologists, work had become absurd. They could see the time not far off where they wouldn't be needed. They saw, as the guy does, what's it called? Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. The worker in that film. He's a young worker about the same time. He sees the absurdity of the hierarchized and mechanized world he's working on. He sees the end of it. He lives as soon as he leaves the factory. They did too. And in this sense, we see the beginnings of the breakup I'm going to talk about, even in the 60s. But today, large parts of production, service, distribution can be modular. Information work is modular work. If you go into a startup or an information company, you see a whiteboard with yellow post-it notes, or any colour post-it notes indeed. And the idea is the teams, formed often in an ad hoc way, wander up to the board, take a task off the board, work on it, document what they achieved, put the yellow post-it back up on the board, write down what's happened. This is when you're making software or a computer game or an A380 on virtual mock-up, and then somebody else can have a go. And the non-sequentiality of it means you don't need the hierarchy, and you don't need quite so much of the discipline. And of course, what you don't need to do is pay people by the hour. You pay them according to targets. Now, modular, non-sequential work requires you to reward outcomes, therefore not attendance, and that, I argue, is what's at the bottom of eroding the link between work and wages. At the top end of the labour market, a lot of us work to targets. At the bottom, and not to hours, we pick up the phone at midnight, but at the same time we can go on Facebook at work, some of us. At the bottom end of the labour market, I think the effect is interesting. What happens at the bottom end of the labour market is that work becomes precisely timed, in a way it wasn't in the factory era. They really care what time a cleaner earning a minimum wage clocks on and clocks off in a London hotel. The only problem is they don't actually care what she does. She clocks on by text message, goes down the basement, cleans, clocks off, goes home, never sees a manager. Why? Because all that manager is actually concerned about is whether they can convince the hotel that they've hit a certain number of cleaning days per month. And so this devaluation of work at extreme low levels of skill and pay is also, in a way, testimony to the fact that work time and remuneration are actually becoming de-linked. They're not urgently linked to each other. And I think at the root of both phenomena, the high-skilled target modular person and the every minute like gold dust skivvy, is the fact that we suddenly need less work. In actual fact, the technological revolution is eating away at the necessary work already, without anybody promoting it at all. The cheapness of things, the cheapening of information are already operating a feedback loop to reduce the hours needed to support economic life on the planet. And so for many of us, therefore, the edges between work and non-work are blurred. You just know what I mean. You're ordering Amazon at work, you're cradling your puppy and your baby, and you're taking your manager's phone call at midnight, desperately trying to type it all into an Excel spreadsheet. But that's not the big problem. The big problem is, as pointed out by the Oxford Martin School in a study in 2013, that 47% of all existing jobs, high or low skilled, are probably automatable in the next 30 years. And so every business sector, every conference I go to is alive with the same obsession: artificial intelligence, robotization, and machine learning. But instead of looking at this thing as an amazing opportunity to rapidly reduce the amount of work human beings have to do, we're terrified of it. We're terrified of it because we see Redcar down the road happening, and we see what's left of Redcar, which is Starbucks or cleaning jobs or 15-minute slots of personal care delivered in your own car to a stopwatch and somebody else shouting at you on the end of a phone. We are terrified of the neoliberal work world that is left after high-value manual work, or indeed high-skill, high-value non-manual work. And so what we do is we create what the anthropologist David Graeber has called bullshit jobs. Jobs that don't really need to exist. You see, when I first got a car, I used to put £1 into a machine, sit in the car, and a big brush would come over, water would spurt at it. Any kids in the back of the car would have a great laugh about it. It was called a car wash. But of course, in the modern world, we don't have car washes. We have 8 blokes with rags who can undercut a machine because they're paying nothing. And many of them, of course, you will know, have questionable migration statuses, so they have no power to even ask for anything more than what they are paid. That's the modern car wash. That's progress. I think my argument is we need to break that cycle, and we need to embrace, as I'll argue, automation. We can proactively pursue this corrosion of the work-wage relationship, proactively pursue the reduction of necessary work time in the world by automation, but we're going to need new social arrangements to do it. Now here's the third and final thing that information is doing to us. It's creating networks and a networked economy which removes the need for hierarchies. We're beginning to see now in the corporate sector, just in the last 2-3 years, big new companies with massive stock market valuations designed on the network principle, where the producers and consumers are the same kind of people. In fact, there's a word for them, prosumers. You put your apartment on an Airbnb, you go to Barcelona and you stay in an Airbnb. Okay. They have few employees and, of course, no social obligations. For economists who believe it was a sensible question to ask why do companies exist, as Ronald Coase did in the 1930s, this is suddenly an interesting time. I've always thought that was a stupid question, but because companies exist because people like each other. But Coase thought that companies wouldn't exist if the overhead cost of a lot of self-employed people just doing business with each other could replace them. And Coase, is posthumously having his moment, in fact, because Uber, Airbnb and TaskRabbit and all these other platforms with multi-billion-dollar valuations are creating a disaggregated company. But I see these as transitory. Like the model factories of the various reactionary monarchies set up when they saw the British factory system. The French monarchy said, we need a factory, let's build one. The only problem was they didn't know why the factory existed, and they always failed. The Bourbon monarchy in the 1820s did this. I see them as this. They're attempts to do commercially what you don't need to do commercially. Because long before Uber and Airbnb, we had the rise of the true, vast networked cooperatives, Wikipedia, Linux, and Apache. When I list these three giants of open source technology, people always say, especially in a corporate conference, come on, tell us something that's spectacular. Well, Wikipedia is the biggest information product in the world. Linux runs every one of the top 500 supercomputers. Apache runs half of all web servers in the world. There's other examples, but these three are really good ones because it means that large parts of the basics of capitalism are being run with free stuff. We, as soon as we were technologically able to, started to create organizations, businesses, as it were, not businesses, that produce stuff voluntarily, collaboratively, in an unmanaged way, and where the wisdom of crowds was used to update and improve a product that could never be owned, nor commercially exploited, except at the margins by service businesses, and which exists as a free tool for everybody else trying to run businesses in a commercial sense. This is a new period. We have not done that. The only people who tried to do it before were cooperatives in the 19th century and utopians. And the difference is these work because the technology enables them. The barriers to people forming ad hoc groups to solve problems, achieve solutions and move on are massively reduced. That's the first impact of the network. The second impact of the network is also interesting. It's the creation of new knowledge. The network effect, if you don't know, it's 101, but you should know the network effect just is put it this way, a telephone network's not much use if only one person has a telephone. If two people have a telephone, it's worth more. And as Theodore Weil, the one-time owner of Bell Telecoms in 1909 said, once we get 1,000 people on the network, it's more useful to everybody. So the more nodes on the network, the more useful and valuable it is. The only problem is we don't know whether it's useful or valuable. Because modern networks are creating, when I interact with you on Twitter later and you ask me a question, it creates a new third kind of knowledge that neither of us owns, nor do we know how useful it is to each other or somebody else. It's what economists have always called externalities. It is a good externality. And of course, the problem is large parts of the corporate world are today based on capturing those externalities, so we can't use them. Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple are all businesses based on capturing the free knowledge me and you generate when we interact, and capturing means we can't see it. Supermarkets doing the same. You know, Tesco's guy, I went to a conference with the Tesco guy, he said, you know what, a new social phenomenon is interfering grandparents. That's one of our new social categories. How do we know? Because we look at the data, and a lot of people who buy nappies also buy the kind of beer, wine and spirits that people over the age of 60 buy. They know that, did you? Knowledge is power, they have it. And of course, governments, security agencies, all kinds of large corporations that interact with the public are hoarding and storing these vast silos of information. The scientists believe that since the Stone Age and 2009, we managed to create 0.8 zettabytes of information, and that between 2009 and now, we've created 1.0 more zettabytes of information. So we've doubled. More than doubled the amount of information humanity has ever created in the last 6 years. The problem is it's all stored, even if most of it's garbage, it's a powerful store of new knowledge, it's all stored in silos you cannot access. As with Kenneth Arrow, it is underutilized on a vast scale. Now, I once interviewed Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, and asked him what his ultimate goal was. He said, after thinking for a minute, I want to build a machine that knows everything. And today, after the work I've done, what I would say back to Larry Page is, if you want to build a machine that knows everything, you're not going to achieve it if you can store all the knowledge accrued from your 2.1 billion unique users, and I can't see it. Because you don't know what the right questions are. Those 2.1 billion people know better than you what the right questions are to ask that data. You, sitting in Mountain View, in California, will only ever ask it a certain range of questions. You cannot ask it all the right questions. So you can't have your machine. And that again, that's the problem of capitalism, post-capitalism. The potential of the economic and social potential is underutilized. And of course, one more impact we should talk about before we finish of network technology is the socialization of knowledge. In my job, we use a program called Final Cut to make video. And in Final Cut, it used to be several thousand pounds per desk. It's now £200 a desk. And I remember 5 years ago, VT editors struggling to make interesting transitions. So instead of it flashes to white when you cut somebody speaking in half, it might look like a Polaroid, like 1 second's worth of like weird Polaroid colours. I can remember spending a lot of time doing that. Once you've done it, it's odds on that in the next version of Final Cut, that is going to appear as a widget that you just drag and drop on. Once it's invented, everybody else can use it. You're not patenting it. You're not using it as proprietary knowledge. In general, these massive amounts of upgrade and invention are stored and then regurgitated into very ordinary products. And so if somebody discovers a bug in Final Cut and Apple fixes it, who owns it, then every Final Cut Pro user over the next 2 nights will have it fixed for them because it will just fix itself. That's what social knowledge is. Now, cutting to the chase. You know, a 19th century engineer who brought his tools into a Tyneside engineering shop. What? Tools, training in his head, training in the muscles memory of his body, and a common set of measurements, tolerances. The 19th century industrial exhibitions always had like a meter, meter and a foot, or in metal, so it couldn't, or silk. It'd be drawn on silk, so it couldn't shrink. It was really important to people have metrics. A 21st century engineer brings into a software house or an aircraft design house tools that are socially created, knowledge that is largely social, and she works on material that is at the same time a tool, a common standard, and a finished product. Information is all three. TCP/IP, which is a basic standard that we use to run the internet, is collectively maintained. Nobody can own it because it's a standard. And yet it is not a standard like ISO 2000 and whatever, stuck on the edge of a factory where you have to have an inspection. It either works or it doesn't work. It's built into the product. Now, We venerate the work of Charles Babbage, the precursor of computer thinking, and increasingly we understand and venerate the work of Ada Lovelace, his contemporary, Byron's daughter, who was the first computer programmer. She managed to program a computer that didn't exist. So if there was an economist at the same time as both of them who'd imagined free machines being produced for free that could last forever, reducing production costs to zero, and storing knowledge socially, we would really venerate that economist. If he described the emergence of a general intellect where social knowledge is the norm, where one upgrade here leads to upgrades everywhere that everybody can use, and in fact the impossibility of privatizing the upgrade, we'd be really, really impressed with that guy. We'd build a statue. In fact, there is such an economist, and it is, of course, Marx. But not the Marx of Capital. Not the Marx of 1867 Capital, but the Marx who wrote an unpublished notebook called The Fragment on Machines one night in 1858, where he basically, we don't know whether a strange leaf had been rolled into Marx's cigar on this evening. We know he wrote at 3 or 4 a.m. But he writes more or less everything that I've just described. If machines could be built that last forever, prices would fall to zero, and the condition of doing that would be the stepping aside of the worker completely from the production process and the storing of all knowledge needed to create things socially so that it became what he called a general intellect. Marx thought what that would do would, quote unquote, blow capitalism sky high. And for those of you who have a relationship to Marxism and Marxist thought, it is a different route than the old contradictions, the worker capitalist, the crisis of underconsumption. It's a completely different scenario. And it's even now in modern Marxist thought there's a massive debate about it. But I'm not so bothered about blowing things sky high anymore. I will settle for corrode, dissolve and replace. So cut to the chase. I think these three things, price mechanism, work and wages, and the network, are really important social realities. They're not blue skies thinking. It's not astronomy. It's there. And it's there in the practice of people who do this, whether or not we're talking about software engineers, sustainability people in companies, people who market. I think many people in commercial life are aware that something weird is going on because of information technology, but the economics can't really understand it or explain it. The unfortunate thing is that we're also living through a whole other period of change, which is to do with the crisis and stagnation of a neoliberal economic model. To finish, because I've run out of time and I could say more, but what I will say is that I think the two are linked. That if we say the problem that lay behind, the proximate causes of 2008 are obvious. Stupid lending, stupid leverage, regulators that didn't know what they were doing, crooks running banks. Okay, that's enough to cause any stock market crash in any decade of capitalist history. So we know what lay behind the proximate causes, but the ultimate cause, of course, I would argue, is the mismatch between having a permanently low wage and stagnant waged workforce, and basically lifestyles kept going through the ever-expanding expansion of credit. That's where we got to in the 1990s, 2000s. I think that's the underlying issue. Why did we do that? Why did we triple the money supply in the world in 7 years when we didn't triple the GDP at all? Why did we do that? Because I think technology convinced some people that there really would be a high-value future where the exponential rise, Moore's law, the exponential rise of capability and the exponential fall of price of technology goods would lead to some kind of exponential takeoff in growth, productivity, and indeed wealth. And it has for 0.1% of people, but not everybody else. And everybody else lives in a financialized world where the new high street is a payday loan place and then a place that sells you white goods at 1,000% interest. And then another place that is a labour agency where you do high-skilled work for minimum wage. That's the new landscape of the high street. And then, of course, Oxfam, Christian Aid, Oxfam. Yeah? So that's the obvious problem. I think that the underlying cause of it might be that if I'm right, then the value proposition for capitalism into the future is actually quite bleak. It can only be the billion dollar valuations of the unicorn companies, Airbnb, Uber, etc., can only be maintained if each one of them captures all the information that's ever going to be generated in the world forever. In other words, the monopoly story is not right. What it promises, it cannot be delivered. Likewise, if spontaneously information is sucking value, sucking price, sucking parts of the world from the market sector into the non-market sector, the encyclopedia business has disappeared into the non-market sector. If that carries on happening, then all scenarios where you leverage, where you basically borrow money now in the hope of making 10 times the profit in the future, will be wrong. And that's in a way what I think was happening in 2008. You're beginning to get signals sent from the future into the present through markets that say what you're trying to do is illusory. Now in the book, and I'll finish on this, in the book I try to say, well, what should you do? And I'm not going to spend time doing that here. We can talk about it in a Q&A. What should you do is, when the answer is not the market, the answer is often quite difficult to find. So nobody should stand up, and I don't pretend to, and say, well, here's the answers. What I do in the book is try and say, well, what would a project look like where you try to proactively push the three tendencies? Push prices closer to zero for essential goods, both by public provision, as in corporation pop, as we used to call it, water, which used to be free, or by encouraging the free provision and the emergence of the free and the shared in the information space and the trickling over of that into the physical space. What if we promoted the dissociation of work from wages through things like the basic income? And what if we promoted and cleared a space for non-capitalist businesses? So businesses like Wikipedia, Linux, Apache, other open source businesses based on sharing and collaboration. And what if we did that as aggressively as early capitalism did for the factory system? You remember that the factory system did not go walking blithely into towns in northern England and saying, hey, we're setting up a factory. It had to be cleared of home-based workers. The workhouses had to be filled with vagrant workers and unmarried mums, so that the factories could then be filled with powerless workers. That's what the state did for early capitalism. I don't propose doing anything inhuman. I do propose aggressively creating a space for the companies like Wikipedia that are there to, what are they there to do? To stop an Uber taking place in the encyclopedia sphere. So we could do that. That's my time up, and you need to ask me some questions, and so do the people in the other room, if you want to, or throw things at me. That is it. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much, Paul. That was tremendous. I wondered how on earth you would be able to get the contents of your book into a lecture. And I should tell you there's a lot more in the book that Paul hasn't gone into at all. So definitely go and buy it. But you can ask about some of those things now, or you can ask about some of the points that Paul made. I'll throw it open to questions. Let me go here and then just behind. Yep, you. The microphone's coming.
Hiya, Paul. Big fan. Capitalism was is protected by a political force in the same sense that feudalism was protected by feudal armies and barons, etc. Does the information economy that you talk about, post-capitalism, need a political force to push it forward? I.e., I'm referencing the left, the political left. Thanks.
I think that's an excellent question. And in the book, what I tried to do is certainly not tie the project completely to the left. Because, and a lot of critics of the book have said, you've underestimated how many people are going to have to overthrow to achieve this goal. But maybe what I've done is I've stepped aside from the problem, because I think it's a big enough problem to have a book that's only focused on these information dynamics and their social impact. And to look at, because we're at an early stage, to look at what is essential and what is non-essential might lead us to to need 2 or 3 more years. For example, Barcelona has more or less outlawed Airbnb and is in the process of outlawing Uber. Boris Johnson might even quash Uber quite quickly. So if we were sitting there going, the capitalists have captured the state, Uber is, now the new fascism or whatever. I'm not saying that. If we said that, we might be very quickly proved wrong. But Peter Drucker, who was the not right-wing but sort of centrist Schumpeterian business guru of the mid-20th century, his last book was called Postcapitalist Society, and based on some of the early viewings of the work I quoted from Paul Romer, he actually, more or less, his 90-year-old mind immediately intuited about 9/10 of what I've just said, albeit from a non-left perspective. But being a Schumpeterian, he understood modes of production, and he said, what we're going to need is a paradigm. So how does it work? Not quite clear. He'd never seen the internet, never seen Windows. Written in 1990. We're going to need an agent of change. And so he imagines, what's the agent of change going to be that creates a post-capitalist society? And he kind of sits there and he says, right, it's going to be something like a universally educated person. Somebody who's capable of dragging and dropping knowledge into their sort of workspace, working with it, and then discarding it. And I thought that's an incredible aperçu to have as a 90-year-old genius in 1990, because that is effectively what we've now got. This is what universities now hopefully produce. It is people able to work with the knowledges. Now, I think what I've said in the book is the networked individual, what socialists call the networked individuals, who clearly have both the ability and the interest to make such a society happen. But I won't rattle on about it now. I think there's a reformist version of this. I think there's a social democratic version of this. I think there's actually a liberal conservative version of it. And I'm not proprietorial about it. I want people to, the first thing is the ideas have to be challengeable. I want them to be on a logic diagram and say, right, if that's not true, then this is also not true. We're at that stage with this level of thinking. Albeit it's been around for 20 years, I don't think anybody has really tried to put it on a grid of challengeability. So I'm more concerned about that than predicting the overthrow of X, Y, or Z government because of it. In fact, just one other anecdote. Syriza in Greece had a whole sub-department of the Deputy Prime Minister's office devoted to this exact question. This is what I've just been talking about. They know all of it. But of course, on their front and centre problem was the fiscal issue of being busted. And so they never got round to doing even 101, any of it.
Thanks. There's a question just here, and then the next one up here.
Yeah, show to it.
So in many respects, my question follows on from this one. I agree with what you're saying, but how does one win the democratic argument? So just to pick as one example of many, you mentioned basic income, which, when you think about it, I think is a pretty good idea. But so the person on the street who politics is white noise, it sounds stupid. How do you win that argument?
Well, look. So again, so how do you win the argument? Basic income is a good idea, but it sounds stupid. Right? Okay. I think the first task is to get people. You can have beer goggles. Anybody ever wear beer? There's post-capitalism goggles as well. In the sense that once you begin to look at reality through the lens of this and the other theorists who talk about it, I think you can see certain things. So a lot of people think that the non-work life, the things they do voluntarily, the networks they create in their personal life, are in some ways just kind of a hobby, kind of a bolt hole from reality. And actually, if you said, in the 1950s that might have been true. You go to a model train club or whatever, Dahlia Growing Society of Newcastle upon Tyne, that was a hobby. But now, if you're in a network and that network is producing social value through doing things, you can actually reconceive what you're doing as a form of non-market voluntary activity. Once you start looking at that, you can then do something else. We talked about it before, but the social geographers here. In Germany, where this stuff is better understood, there's a project to map it all. And it's really, once you start mapping the non-capitalist economy, it becomes quite impressive. Where is it? Is it Leeds, where there's a restaurant that only serves food that comes out of the waste of, it's the waste food from supermarkets. So that's there. Then there'll be a food bank. Then there'll be a timeshare. Then there'll be a software house that runs 3 or 4 tools that are open source. And maybe there's a workers' collective here, co-op here. Map it, and it becomes possible to see the future. And I always go back to that scene in Wolf Hall where Mark Rylance has got this this dissolute aristocrat on a bed, and he's basically sort of about to sort of almost physically sort of destroy him. One of these lords, and he says to him, I don't know whether it's in the novel, I've never read the novels, but in the screenplay, he says, "You think the world is about castles, jousting, and chivalry, and I will tell you that I can switch off your world tomorrow with one message to my banker friends in Amsterdam, because it's all funded by capital." In fact, he says something like that. In actual, it's about banks, commerce, and knowledge. So you've got, it's capitalism versus feudalism. But if you sat there in Henry VIII's court, actually, it's quite a revolutionary thing to say. There is, in the interstices of the old world, there's a new world. And once we understand its power, we can switch off a lot of the old world quite quickly. So I would do that, rather than trying to convince people with this or that or the other demand or project. And I also think the other thing is it's provability and modelling. Try it, do it again and again. Try and, just as in the entrepreneurial space, try and fail. Try and fail with your organic coffee shop. Try and fail with your workers. Z Books has 250 people. Big publishing house in London, 250 people in a true workers' co-op. There is no management. It produces some very, very decent academic literature. Try it. And the other thing is document it. And the other thing is model stuff. I think modelling is the new planning for this, in the sense that, and it's something that MacDonald has picked up on out of my book, that if it's all very well for people to say it won't work, let's do what we do with modern aircraft. We'll model the stresses 186 million times and see how many times it comes out dud. After that, I'll tell you, that's a far more reliable form of planning and execution than most politics achieves. So that's what I would say. Can we take? Do you want to take this lady next to her?
Oh yeah, okay. And then there's
Can I just take it? Go on quickly then.
I agree.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is you can't try it unless you convince the person who's on those low wages and is going to expand results actually go to the ballot box and vote for it.
I think that comes further down the line. I think with this, it's so big it comes further down the line. There's a critique of neoliberalism and measures you need to do. That you can do that, but this, I think we need more time. Lady next to you, can we just take some? Go on.
I'll try to shout.
Yeah. There's a mic there. You don't need to. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting lecture. Thank you. I was particularly interested in the point you made about the possibility of people working less because of advances in technology. But it reminded me of an essay I read by Bertrand Russell in the 1930s. And post-industrialism, he made a similar point that actually instead of 12 hours a day, people could work 4. But instead, what he saw was that people continued to work for as long, and unemployment just stayed the same or rose. And it's the same kind of situation that we have now. So I kind of wondered, how would you go about convincing people that they can work less?
I should have said more clearly. I think it's one of the bits I skipped over when I started panicking about time. The normal adaptation method of capitalism does exactly that. It replaces low-skilled, automatable work with automation, and then it creates a new paradigm in which there are new needs created, new consumption needs, and new products which need higher value work, more intricate work, higher value raw materials, and higher skills. That is the story of the Belle Epoque, the progressive era, so 1898 to 1914. That's exactly what happened. You know, poor old Rosa Luxemburg is sitting there in Berlin going, there's no new markets, capitalism's run out of markets. And in the time it took her to write the book, The Accumulation of Capital, the number of cinemas in Berlin went from 1 to 168. So, you know, looking in the wrong place. Germany's got no colonies, so it's doomed. Well, no, there are things you can do. And so you create internally. Now, there's not time to go into the argument, but the first thing is to say information makes it quite difficult to create high value, high skill, in this sense, scarce and difficult to do stuff. You know, if you think Moore's law is impressive, look at the exponential fall in the cost of DNA sequencing. So sequencing DNA, if you think you're going to have if you thought you were going to have a career as a high-value scientist sequencing DNA, well, the curve's like that, like that. So it's going to be done by machine. And so you can't uninvent information technology. It applies to everything. You can create the bullshit jobs, you can create the low-wage jobs that don't have any relationship to technology, but I don't think you can take the technology dynamic away, and therefore that's why modern developed societies where politicians bang on year after year about creating high-skill, high-value jobs never achieve them. That's the first thing. I think that there's more to be said then about what we. So the other part of it is this. In the book I write a lot about, which I haven't covered here, about the theory of long cycles in capitalism, about what causes one technological business paradigm to rise, hit a crisis and then fall. And what I say is that what's nearly always crucial in forcing this adaptation, where you get new industries, higher value industries, higher value technology, is nearly always the resistance power of organised labour. So the resistance of organised labour in the 1830s creates the world of the Chamberlains, the world of cities that have sewers and drains and lights. And then the resistance of organised labour in the late 19th century creates eventually scientific management and the production line. And then the resistance of organised labour in the 30s and 40s again creates the need to do more automation. If you can smash the working class, as happened in Japan, America and ultimately Western Europe, in the 1970s and 1980s, there's no impetus for a high-value solution. You can have a low-value solution. And that is, I'm afraid, what we've got. This neoliberalism, I will argue, is a dead end. It's not a new form of capitalism. It's the old form of capitalism extended by about 25 years because workers were removed from the ability to fight back. And therefore, it's easier to set up a low-wage construction company or a coffee bar or a cleaning business or a security guard firm than it is to take the same money and stick it in to inventing stuff. And the new spirit of post-capitalism, Weber talked about the spirit of capitalism. I believe that what is so important about what has begun in the Wikipedias and the Linux and the collaborative work spaces that I've studied is that there is a different spirit. It says, let's not set up a cleaning business. Do you want to take one more question?
One more question. I'm glad you covered that because I thought that was all really important in your book. And there's a man in the second row at the back there with his hand up who's been waiting for quite a while.
When you're talking about the socialised individual, I guess that comes across as being the ultimate in human agency ultimately. But does that mean that politics is dead, that certainly representative politics is dead? I mean, I've been a political activist for almost 3 decades. I've been wasting my time, so I've just been following stuff I was interested in collaboratively with other people.
No, I don't think that. But what I would say is that the power, it's a whole different debate, and Clay Shirky's book, Here Comes Everybody, I think is a brilliant starter for understanding it. The barriers to entry for effective collective action are so low that you don't need the same kind of hierarchical organisation to achieve it. And the example I always use, which looking at the age profile of this audience, you will get, but you'll also understand why everybody young starts laughing half the way through it. Okay. In the anti-apartheid movement, you used to go to your union branch and you used to say, let's pass a resolution in support of the South African miners. And then, once you got it past some kind of old Cold War right-winger, that you could actually move the motion, it would go up to the regional office of the union. And then they would decide whether or not they were going to do it. And then that would go to national office. And if, by some amazing miracle, the National Steering Committee said they were going to support the South African miners' strike, and if it was still going on, they'd send a fax to the... Oh no, you see, you're laughing. You would not believe how quickly young people laugh at this, but carry on. You send a fax to the South African NUM, and then they send the fax down to their guys on the coalface, and somebody goes down and they read it out. The teachers of Leicestershire are with us. No. Of course, any one of you with a mobile phone will know what you do now. You just phone up the NUM in South Africa. You just text them. You just tweet them. You say, we're with you. Yeah. But why did we need to do that? Because in the old hierarchical world, nothing was possible without hierarchies. You couldn't win an election, you couldn't stage a campaign. You know, the Popular Front against fascism in the 1930s was a formal agreement between communist, socialist and liberal parties in, for example, France and Spain, because they said, we can't do it, peasants and the half-literate workers said, can't do it on our own sitting here. We don't have a phone, there isn't a phone in the village, there's no fax machine, they're not invented. You need hierarchy. So I think it's the best way I could say is like now, instead of, what a lot of us in political activism used to do was, I thought of myself as a left-wing activist in the 80s, as a lever on a big boulder. And all I wanted to do was pull that lever and get that boulder moving and get it rolling. Now, the better tactic is be a little stone and start rolling. Because you have the ability to assemble a lot of other little stones around one task that don't agree with you on all the other tasks. And I think that, therefore, for politics, the challenge for politics is, it's like the absurdity of Labour sitting there saying, you can't join because you voted for another party, or you can't join because you've once tweeted against our leader or whatever. Most people are going, you know, I have 5 personalities in my life. You know, I'm this on Tinder, I'm this on Grindr, I'm this on Facebook. No, seriously, I'm this on World of Warcraft. That's how people live. The idea that they must have one loyalty and one personality is gone. It's a whole different debate, but that is partly, the serious part of it is what I argue, why the forms of political activism and engagement are going to actually be around these multiple personalities and commitments that people have rather than one. But I hope that it went some way to answering your question, because there's a lot more in the book that I've tried to answer.
Which is what I've been saying as well. Go and buy the book, there's loads more.
Don't all buy it, right? Thank you.